On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, a little naval history as we look at 6 Navy fleet oilers that changed the course of World War II early in the Pacific. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So back in April, I went on World War II TV on YouTube. Paul Woodage hosts this site. It is a fantastic site. If you are an advocate, a historian for World War II, you really need to follow Paul's channel. He brings on authors to talk about books and articles and research that they're doing. He does it live so that the audience can stream in questions. It is an hour of really historians talking about their topic. He's just branched off, started a new channel, World War I TV, which follows the same kind of format. Paul himself lives in Normandy. He's a big, huge Normandy historian, does live tours in the area. If you ever want to go to Normandy and get a great tour guide, I recommend Paul to do it. But back in April, he invited me on. I had just finished up or was nearing completion of an article that I submitted for publication. I haven't heard word on it yet. And the topic I had was on 6 U.S. Navy fleet oilers and the important role they play in the first, literally about 6 to 8 months of World War II, in not just supplying the U.S. Navy fast carrier task forces, but for maintaining the supply line between the United States, Hawaii, and Australia. And Paul has graciously allowed me to air that video on my channel. I waited 3 months because I wanted it to finish kind of getting all the hits it was going to get on his channel. I did not want to deprive him of any of the subscriptions and views. But he allowed me to do this, and I'm going to go ahead and post it here on my channel. I recommend you head on over to Paul's channel. It's World War II TV, WW2 TV on YouTube. Subscribe. I guarantee you will find a video on there of a topic you're interested in. I want to thank Paul and the whole crew over there for doing this, allowing me to have it. And without any further ado, Paul and I talking about the 6 Navy oilers.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the final show in our Pacific week. There was going to be something for Friday, but it's not happening till a couple of weeks later. But on Monday, we start our fantastic, I'm saying that in advance because I know it's going to be, Torch to Tunis series. I think it's 15 shows we've got coming your way over 3 weeks. Some amazing guests, Vince O'Hara, Michael Nyberg, just some fantastic subjects. We'll be talking about infantry battles, naval campaigns, the politics behind it, some individual armored units. It'll be fantastic. If you're new to the channel, if you've seen something I've been putting on Twitter the last couple of days, thank you. Welcome aboard. Please don't forget to subscribe by clicking the button and the bell so you receive notifications, and maybe consider becoming a patron and or channel member. Anyway, my guest today is Sal. He's the host of the popular YouTube channel What's Going On with Shipping. He's a former merchant mariner. Now he's a historian, and he'll be talking about the vital supply line between the USA and Australia that fueled the Pacific campaign. So good afternoon, Sal. How are you today?
Paul, I am fine. Thank you so much for having me on. A big honor.
Well, it's a big honor to have you. You get massive views on your channel. So all things nautical is obviously what floats your boat, pardon the pun. And when you're studying World War II, it's all about logistics when you get to the Pacific, isn't it? So that's what you're coming at today, is talking about supply lines. So was that always the kind of the area of history you found interesting, or is that as you've got older and looking into global things, is logistics the thing you move into when you get middle-aged? You start off with battles and
No, the truth was I was a merchant mariner. I sailed ships for a living for quite a few years, and I was in the first Persian Gulf War. Right. And when I was in the first Persian Gulf War, I saw the logistics that brought a massive force to Saudi Arabia back in 1990, 91. And I was really interested in how we did that. How can you do that? How can you move not just 500,000 troops, but all their logistics, everything they need, food, fuel, beans and bullets. And when I stopped sailing, I was like, okay, I want to go find out about this. And I did what most people do, go get a book. And I really couldn't find a good book that talked about this. And that started my career. I did a master's thesis on the Merchant Marine in the Vietnam War, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the role of the Merchant Marine in national defense in the 20th century for the U.S. And I've just kind of delved into that topic more and more as I go on.
That definitely seems to be one of those things that gets glossed over in some of the broad histories. They will say, and we invaded so-and-so, and this involved X number of tons of supplies and X number of thousands of bullets and bandages, and they'd all had to be brought from, and they say where they came from. And then they move on to the battle, and there's no real explanation of just that constant toing and froing of vessels. But anyway, we're going to talk about that today. You've come on with a PowerPoint that you'll load up on screen, folks. We'll do questions as we go along today. Questions for Salah about logistics, about the Oilers, particularly we're talking about, and it should be a good one. So just going to bring it in again. There we go. So over to you, Sal.
Yeah, so let me go back here for a second. So this title is kind of a play on Ian Toll's Six Frigates, and because Ian Toll wrote one of the great trilogies of the Pacific War. And one of the things I love in Ian Toll's work, same thing with Hornfisher, and there's a whole batch of historians that have really delved into the Pacific in a way that we didn't get with Samuel Eliot Morison. And so for me, the idea of the six Oilers is an interesting one, because if you wrote a history of the early war in the Pacific, it's on the six carriers. It's on the Enterprise, it's Saratoga, it's Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and Wasp, because they play such a crucial role early in the war. And you see them, they're the heart of many talks you've had right here on the channel. But behind the scenes, always attached to them, steaming behind them, are the six Oilers. These are six Oilers that were really, I would argue, crucial to the success of not just the fast carriers, but maintaining that sea line of communication to Australia early in the war. And when you look at these six Oilers, you're looking at Neosho, Platte, Sabine, Kaskaskia, Cimarron, and Guadalupe. They're mentioned, you see them mentioned, but not a lot of context, except for maybe Neosho, which is sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. And one of the things I really wanted to do was in this article I'm writing is take a look at them and see what impact they had on the evolution of the strategies. Now, we've seen much more work done on this. John Lundstrom, for example, has done a great job in this in some of his works, but I'd argue that even John's work looks at it, but doesn't look at the entire picture. So what I want to look at is a couple of aspects here. The first part I want to talk about is technology, is how the technology of this underway replenishment developed. Because I think there's a big misunderstanding with how this was done during the war. If you read Samuel Eliot Morison's 15-volume series on World War II in the Pacific, which was the standard reference tool throughout the for most historians, he looks at underway replenishment late in the war. And then he takes the late war prism of how it was accomplished and applies it to the early war. And that's not how it was done. And I think that's a big misconception in understanding it. So I'm actually going to take you back to World War I for just a second, because it's really the World War I experience that feeds World War II, as you well know. Many of the lessons, many of the leaders that really make the decisions in World War II come from World War I. And in World War I, the U.S., when it enters late in the war in April of 1917, is forward deploying destroyers to Queenstown, to Ireland, to participate in the U-boat campaign. 3 of those destroyer divisions go across, they sail across the Atlantic unaccompanied. But the 4th group that goes across, Destroyer Division 5, is under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Newton on board the USS Patterson. And his destroyers are a smaller type. The ones we sent across earlier were 1,000-ton destroyers. His are 740-ton destroyers. And these were nicknamed the Flivers. They were mass-produced, kind of like the Model Ts. But he didn't have the range to get across. So midway across the Atlantic, he met a U.S. Navy tanker, the Maumee. And on board Maumee, the executive officer on board is a lieutenant commander by the name of Chester Nimitz. And Nimitz had helped develop the process of underway replenishment, how to fuel vessels while underway. This had been experimented in years before World War I, but it is really the destroyer force commander, an admiral by the name of Albert Gleaves, that in 1916 got his destroyer divisions to perfect this. And Patterson, who eventually becomes Nimitz's deputy, he actually becomes the deputy
commander of Pacific Ocean areas, is on Patterson. Nimitz is on Maumee. And here you see the first combat underway replenishment taking place. And that underway replenishment is a really unique one because today, when you do an underway replenishment, ships sail about 160 feet apart. They steam at about 13 knots, and they stream these long rigs between each other. This is a much different arrangement. These vessels actually tie themselves to each other. There's actually a line that's attached to the bow of the destroyer, and the tanker tows it, almost like someone who's water skiing behind a boat. And then there are short lines that are attached to the side of the vessel to keep it in place. And then you fly over the hoses. And this is done at a very slow speed, about 5 knots, very close together, about 50 feet. And you need really good weather to do this. And this is the parameters that we'll see underway replenishment early in World War II. This is the method that they're going to use. And unfortunately, a lot of historians, when they look at underway replenishment in World War II, look at the method that's developed much later, where they're further apart, going faster, and it's much more robust. But this is the method they really developed early in the war, and it's very successful. This mid-ocean oiler is established through December of 1917. Several Navy oilers rotate through here: the Maumee, the Kanawha, the Kumeyaw, the Arethusa. At the same time, the U.S. will charter and commission 6 commercial tankers, and they're going to run fuel to Queenstown to provide the fuel for them. So in many ways, the U.S. sets up its idea of forward logistics in the First World War. This is the model, and it's in the back of Nimitz's and Newton's head as they do this. In the interwar years, the U.S. Navy develops tankers. They build a fleet of tankers during the interwar years. But many of these are pretty small. They're anywhere between 50 to 70,000 barrels of fuel. A barrel is about 42 gallons, and fairly slow, about 10 to 14 knots. And these tankers are designed to provide fuel to forward bases, and most importantly, to refuel destroyers, which are the short-legged assets that they have. And that's really what the focus is on. But as you know, the U.S. Navy during the interwar years conducts a series of fleet exercises, the fleet problems. And one of the things that they learned, particularly in the Pacific, is the Pacific is a big honking ocean. It's not the Atlantic. The Atlantic is 3,000 miles. The Pacific is 7,000 miles. And one of the things they learned very quickly is destroyers aren't just running out of fuel, but so are the cruisers, so are the carriers. And what they really need to do is perfect underway replenishment for all types of vessels. If you look at the U.S. Navy destroyers that are built after the flush decks, the 4 stackers, every U.S. destroyer has to have a range of 5,000 nautical miles minimum. That's the minimum they put in. However, even that's not going to be enough. And so the U.S. Navy starts to develop new methods of underway replenishing, not just the destroyers, but the bigger ships. So this is an image from...
Just a quick question for you. It may be coming up later on, but I don't want to scroll back too far up and lose it. From Phil Bosworth, were there any issues with boats getting sucked together when it's comparatively close?
Yep. Matter of fact, I'm going to talk about a specific case where this happens. This is a particularly dangerous situation where the ships... Now, initially with the destroyers, it wasn't too much of a problem. Destroyers, like I said, the Patterson there is 740 tons. The Maumee is about 10,000 tons. This changes dramatically when you're refueling a 30,000-ton aircraft carrier from a 25,000-ton oiler. And that's where you start seeing a lot of the problems develop. And it does happen. As a matter of fact, there's going to be one case I talk about specifically here in a second. So this is a refueling between the Bravos, which is a sister ship of Maumee, and Yorktown in April of 1940. And as someone who worked for the U.S. Navy for a few years, did underway replenishment, I can't tell you how much this gives me anxiety at looking at how close together these vessels are. This is ridiculously close. But again, this is the method that they're using because they have to be this close. If you look at the image on the right, you see that the Bravos basically hangs the rigs from these booms they have out. And you can't allow the hoses to drag in the ocean, they'll rip out. And so you have to get fairly close. And you can see you need pretty good weather, you need a pretty good sea state to execute this operation. And this was fairly typical of the refueling that was done prior to Pearl Harbor by the U.S. Navy. Now you have another technology that comes in. The U.S. Navy realizes we are looking at a potential world war. And, one of the big differences between the Navy in World War II and World War I, I always argue, is the Navy is much more prepared to go into World War II than it was to go into World War I. You know about the Two Ocean Navy Act that lays down the keels of the modern Essex-class carriers and the fast battleships of the Iowa class. What's not always known is that there was a Merchant Marine Act of 1936 that lays down 50 ships a year for 10 years. So there's a plan to build 500 commercial vessels, and hulls 2 through 13 are 12 fast tankers, what are known as the Cimarron class. And these tankers were basically being built for commercial firms, Keystone Shipping, still around today, Standard Oil, which is modern day Exxon. And these tankers were built to a modified design. Instead of sailing at 14 knots with one screw and a small fuel capacity, these were much larger. These are 150,000 barrel tankers. They have twin screws. They can steam at 18 knots. And they have the provision to be fitted with armament, extra crews, everything you need to convert them into ready-made fast oilers. 12 of them are built, and almost immediately they start being grabbed by the U.S. Navy. So much so that by the start of World War II, December 7th for the United States, all 12 are in the U.S. Navy. 6 of them will eventually wind up in the Pacific. 2 will be in the Atlantic, and 4 of them are converted into Sangamon class escort carriers. And the 6 in the Pacific are the ones I really want to focus on, because those are the ones, to me, that execute the wartime mission. The wartime mission here is twofold. Number one, doing that underway replenishment and providing the fuel necessary to the fast carriers. And then the second mission that they do, which isn't always talked about, but really should be, is delivering fuel to bases so that other oilers can pull that fuel as needed. Their speed is such that they can steam with the fast carriers, but they can also deposit fuel and let the smaller oilers that the U.S. Navy has pull that fuel to sustain the fast carriers. And so that mission is a very interesting one. And that's why I want to kind of talk about it a little bit and go through a series of those operations. So the standard image we have of World War II is early in World War II, you have the massive Japanese offensive. This is a kind of a composite chart I pulled from the U.S. Military Academy's World War II Atlas. And I kind of combined 2 of these charts together. One of them is the Japanese offensive, where the Japanese Kito Butai is running the Pacific from Pearl Harbor all the way down into the South Pacific, all the way into the Indian Ocean. At the same time, the U.S. responds with their fast carriers, their raids. But what I like about this chart a lot, and I added a little part in here, is it shows the 2 main priorities for the U.S. early in the war. In December of 1941, you have the Acadia Conference, where the U.S. meets with the British to talk about strategy in the Pacific. And the 2 strategies they talk about that are paramount is, number one, the mission given to Admiral Nimitz, defend Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Johnson Island Triangle, defend the Central Pacific. The second one is maintain the communications in the sea lanes to Australia. Because what is not always acknowledged, I think, and misses a lot, is that the sea line of communication to Australia on the West Coast is severed. It is severed. Think about where Australia gets its oil from. It got it from the British East Indies. It got it from, the British East Indies. It got it from Malaysia. It got it from Indonesia. It got it from the Persian Gulf. That is separated. When the Kito Butai goes into the Indian Ocean in April of 1942, it severs that. The British Indian Ocean fleet, the Pacific fleet, has to go all the way back to Africa. And now all of a sudden, the U.S. has to assume the supply of Australia. And that supply to Australia is a problem, because while ships would sail from the west coast of the United States, from Hawaii, even from Panama to Australia, they were very rare. It was very specialized vessels that would do that. Now you have to do that. That supply line from Panama to Australia is 7,000 miles. To the west coast of the United States is 5,000. To Hawaii, it's 4,000. And so almost immediately, the U.S. realizes it's going to be very difficult to keep Australia in the war. We got to provide them food, oil, everything. And this is the paramount. I argue that John Lundstrom did a book in the 1970s entitled The South Pacific Campaign. Doesn't get a lot of attention, but it is a masterful book that identifies how important this supply line is. One of the very first things the U.S. does early in the war is establish a base at Bora Bora in Tahiti, which I would have signed on for in a minute. That's the deployment I want to go on, is be stationed in Tahiti. And the reason they set up this base in Bora Bora, what becomes known as Operation Bobcat, is they need a fueling site so that they can refuel vessels heading to Australia, because you can't pull oil out of Australia. And what you need is vessels that can go to Australia and come back, but most vessels don't have 10,000, 14,000 mile range. And so right from the very beginning, Bora Bora, and then a whole series of other islands, Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia, Espiritu Santos, Canton, Christmas Island, or Palmyra, all these islands become really essential. And what you see early in the war in the Pacific is a race for islands. Most of these islands have no defenses on them. They may be owned by the Americans, the British, the Australians, the Japanese, but whoever gets there first gets the island. And in many ways, the South Pacific is a rush for these islands. Who can get there and who can establish themselves?
I just want to jump in, Sal, and just briefly
Sure.
connect with the fact when we do a lot of shows about the Australian involvement in World War II, and this is prior to the US being involved, is that people question why Australia was concerned with the Middle East, why they were sending forces out. Well, oil and fuel and supplies was one of their issues. It wasn't just the inherent kind of support for the British Empire. They were there because they were heavily invested in where their material goods came from, and the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean, and that was all part of it. So just connecting the dots there for people who wonder why the Australians were, and New Zealand as well, were in the Mediterranean in 1940-41. It's all to do with oil. It's all to do with supplies.
Oh, exactly right. I mean, why does the Australian division go to Singapore?
Yeah. Brilliant. So I just wanted to add that in there, but loving it, by the way. Fantastic stuff.
No, and I think it's also clear, too, you get a lot of historians who talk about the idea, well, Japan's going to invade Australia. It's clear from the records that's never going to be an issue. However, if Japan continues on its advances, if it seizes Port Moresby, if it takes Midway, the next plan is to seize New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. That's not going to sever the supply line to Australia, but it's going to push it further out. It's going to force this supply line to be even longer, which may get Australia to back out of the war, to at least acknowledge that it's hard to sustain their population. And that's the effort that I think doesn't get the acknowledgement in many ways, because this supply line is a very difficult one. It's akin to the supply line that the British have to establish in a very small margin down to the Falklands in the 1980s. And it's the thing that the U.S. Navy is talking about today about going to Taiwan. This is a long supply line, and distance, the tyranny of distance, is a tough one. So I just want to walk you through a couple of early operations. I'm not going to do the battles. That's not what we're going to do in this. But what I want to talk about here is just a little bit of how the logistics plays a part here. So, for example, Pearl Harbor. USS Neosho is smack dab there in the middle of Battleship Row on the day of the attack of Pearl Harbor. She is there just behind the California and just forward of Maryland and Oklahoma. And amazingly, it's not hit. When I would argue one of the biggest faults the Japanese did in the attack on Pearl Harbor isn't attacking the oil tanks. It's a whole separate one. But the fact that Neosho was sitting there fully loaded and didn't get a torpedo when everybody else did was a huge error. Matter of fact, the captain of the Neosho will back that ship out in the middle of the attack to get it out of Battleship Row and move it into position. But let's talk about fuel at Pearl Harbor for a second. You always hear the third wave. The third wave. What if the third wave had hit those tanks? That image there that on the left is of the big tanks above Mary Point. There were 17 of those. Each of those tanks can hold the equivalent to one of the fast oilers, about 150,000 barrels of fuel. There was tank capacity at Pearl Harbor between the upper fuel tanks, which you see there, the middle fuel tanks, which are at the very top, and then the lower fuel tanks, of about 4.1 million barrels. By my research, I found out that basically the fuel farm was anywhere between 1/2 to 3/4 full at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So even if the Japanese had come in and hit some of these tanks, some of them would have been empty. Some of them may not have had fuel. But understand, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel could not keep the oil supplied at Pearl Harbor. He was hard pressed to keep the tanks full just on normal usage. One of the reasons the battleships don't sail with Enterprise and Lexington to Wake and Midway Island is that he didn't have the fuel. He was husbanding his fuel for when he needed it, because that was a big issue. Had the Japanese gone in, had they been able to destroy half of the oil capacity, that would have been important, but not as crucial as the fact that right at this time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was not enough fuel at the moment to really sustain the Pacific offensive. Ironically, knocking the battleships out alleviates part of the fuel issue for Admiral Nimitz when he comes in, because now he doesn't have to fuel the battleships. He can focus on the fast carriers. Let me get my next slide here. I got to hit my zeros here. 1 second. There we go. So the early carrier raid. So you asked, the question was asked about collision. So one of the features you'll see in the early carrier raids is the attachment of the fast oilers. Now, where you see that not happen is in the early attempt to relieve Wake Island. I think I went past it. There we go. The attempt to relieve Wake Island. When the Admiral Fletcher is sent to go save the Marines on Wake Island, he has a problem because Wake Island is a big distance from Pearl Harbor. There's the famous story of the Enterprise missing the attack on Pearl Harbor because of refueling. Enterprise had been sent out to deliver a Marine squadron to Wake Island. Now, it didn't have an oiler with it. So the distance from Pearl Harbor to Wake is about 1,500 miles, I think it is, off the top. Maybe, excuse me, further, maybe about 2,000 miles. When he's coming back in, Enterprise is at 50% fuel capacity. His cruisers are at 30%. His destroyers are at 20%. And the reason he's not in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th is he refueled once heading out. He refueled the destroyers from his heavy cruisers. This was a skill they learned during the interwar period, during those fleet exercises, to use cruisers and carriers to refuel destroyers. But then on the way back in, it's December in the North Pacific. I know we call Pearl Harbor in the Central Pacific, but it's really in the Northern Pacific. It's December in the Northern Pacific. It's rough. It's not great weather. And he can't refuel his destroyers. So he's got to slow down and wait for better weather to do it. And that slows him up coming into Pearl Harbor. But that gives you an indication of how much fuel they're using. Destroyers are designed to sail at a modicum speed of 15 knots. But during carrier operations, when you're launching aircraft, especially 1941 era aircraft, you need to get the carriers up to 25 knots. You need to get speed over the deck. When you're landing them, you need increased speed to land them. And that burns the fuel through your destroyers at a rate. 15 knots, you're burning a set consumption. When you jump to 25 knots, you triple your fuel consumption. If you go to 30 knots, it's almost 5 times as much. And so one of the things that was learned when the Enterprise came back in is like, okay, if we're going to go relieve Wake Island, we got to send an oiler. The only oilers available was an older oiler, the Netches, which is the most experienced oiler. This is the oiler that everyone had trained with. And then Neosho, the big, huge, fast oiler. But Neosho hadn't been outfitted yet to do underway replenishments because it was impressed to bring fuel from California to Pearl Harbor for Admiral Kimmel. So Neosho and its 4 sister ships that were on the West Coast were doing nothing but shuttle runs, just hauling fuel as fast as they can. So Netches goes out with Admiral Fletcher on the Saratoga and Task Force 14 to go relieve Midway. And he is eviscerated, Admiral Fletcher, in almost every history for this, because he is criticized for not fueling his ships and for his slow advance to Wake Island. And I would argue they failed to understand this ship and its capabilities. This ship has a max speed of 14 knots. It has to do an underway replenishment in the North Pacific in rough weather that we just saw Admiral Halsey coming back in with problems. No one ever criticizes Halsey for poor fueling, because if Admiral Halsey had been efficient in his fueling, he would have been in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. So Fletcher's heading out. The other issue is Fletcher wants to refuel at the very last moment because he wants to have as much fuel in his ships for the run-in to Wake Island, because he doesn't know what he's going to run into. Is he going to run into 6 aircraft carriers of the Kitu Butai? Is he going to run into just 2 carriers of Carrier Division 2? He doesn't know. And what he doesn't want to be is saddled with a 14.5 knot oiler running away from the battle and his destroyers at 20% fuel. And so that forces him to refuel and basically miss the opportunity to hit Wake Island. Ironically, a few months later in January, the Lexington is sent out to Wake Island again to do a raid. And that raid is canceled when this ship, the Netches, is sunk by a Japanese submarine. We forget how efficient Japanese submarines were early in World War II. They are on the West Coast. They are sinking ships like crazy around Hawaii. There are 6 ships that are sail from Hawaii on December 17th. These are commercial vessels. Of those 6 ships, 3 are sunk. 2 by submarines and 2 by auxiliary cruisers. And so the submarine menace is absolutely atrocious around Pearl Harbor. And Netches doesn't have an escort. It is sent out and is sunk by a Japanese submarine. And this forces Admiral Nimitz, by the way, to realize I have got to escort these support ships. I can't just allow them to go out by themselves, because if I lose them, I could conceivably cause an operation to be canceled, as what happened with Lexington. Then you get the fast carrier raids. And these are the raids on the Marshalls and the Gilberts, Wake Island, Rabaul, Ley, all those raids. And every one of those raids will have a fast oiler attached to them. And you asked about a collision before that they rub together. When Yorktown comes out from the west coast after coming through the Panama Canal, and it's escorting the Marine Brigade to Samoa, it has one of the fast oilers with them, Kaskaskia. And during an underway replenishment, Kaskaskia and Yorktown hit each other. They basically get sucked into each other, rips apart the rigs, rips the booms apart, and basically, refueling in early World War II would get environmentalists crazy because of the amount of fuel that's dumped in the ocean. It was a huge problem. This image shows you Sabine refueling Enterprise. If you can get the confused image here of hoses and lines, and the fact that the well deck, the tank deck of the Sabine is basically underwater where the crews are working, it gives you an idea of the danger associated with these underway replenishments. And the fast oilers become synonymous with the fast carriers. Every task force organization you will look at, you will see them here. And you really can't range across the Pacific without these fast oilers. These oilers are able to plus up the task forces before they make their run in, and then they're able to extract themselves with the fast carriers on the way out. You can't do that with a 10.5 or 14 knot oiler. You need an 18 knot oiler with 150,000 barrels of fuel. And then you come to Coral Sea. And one of the most interesting things, and someone referenced the Gray Book. The Gray Book is a great asset. Historians who aren't reading the Gray Book on a routine basis are really missing out on some great insight. Volume 1, if you read Volume 1, and this is what really struck me about it, is how much logistics plays a huge role in this. Next to the aircraft carriers, do a search for the oilers, and you'll see them all the time. In April of 1942, when they're talking about the Coral Sea operation, remember, Nimitz plans to send all his carriers down there, the Lexington and Yorktown and Enterprise and Hornet. And they do a study, a logistics study, and what Nimitz's logisticians come up with is to sustain those carriers down there is going to require a lot. A carrier task force, a fast carrier task force, burns about 5,000 to 6,000 barrels of fuel per day. And he estimates to sustain the 4 carriers in the South Pacific. And understand, the reason the carriers are in the South Pacific is to guard that supply line. This is Admiral King. King is overriding Nimitz on this, telling him you have to guard the supply line to Australia. It's the reason the fast carriers are down there. To sustain 4 carrier task forces down there are going to take 5 fast oilers, 3 of the older oilers, and then 2 commercial tankers. So one of the things that Nimitz gets from Admiral King early in the war in January of 1942 is 22 commercial tankers. King will charter from the commercial merchant marine 22 tankers. And these tankers are going to take a lot of the duties off the oilers to provide fuel to the forward bases, to Pearl Harbor, to Bora Bora, and other bases now. But even that is not enough. Nimitz in March screams to King, I need more. I need 4 more tankers. And then he screams for more. And at one point, King tells him in April, I can't send you any more tankers because German U-boats are sinking them faster than I can send them to you in the Caribbean on the East Coast. And so you see how the global nature of the war, when you listen to Evan Mausley and Paul Kennedy and Craig Simons talk about the global aspect of World War II, that's the important aspect. You got to look at this globally because the German U-boats are impacting the ability to support carrier task forces in the South Pacific. But the study they do is absolutely amazing. So he needs 8 oilers. He needs 3 commercial tankers. He estimates that he needs per month in the South Pacific 450,000 barrels of oil delivered by those 8 Navy oilers. And then on top of it, 120,000 barrels delivered by commercial tankers. And even then he sits there and says, I can do this for a month and that's it. And then we've got to pull the carriers back. And what alleviates this is 2 things. Number one, the sinking of Lexington. Believe it or not, if you're going to lose a carrier, the carrier to lose is Lexington. It's not the most efficient air platform because of its elevators, but it's also the biggest fuel hog of the carriers. And so much rather to keep Yorktown than Lexington. And then you lose Neosho. Great book on the history of the Neosho, but one of the things I think the author misses is how it fits into the context here. Losing Neosho was absolutely critical. There's a comment in the Gray Book. We can't afford to lose fast oilers. We need to be more careful in protecting them. And so the decision is made that, fortunately, that the carriers have to pull back anyway because the Midway operation is coming up. And so everything is pulled back for Midway. So in my study for this, I came across 2 things I never knew, and one of the things you love being a historian is finding stuff like, holy crud, I didn't realize this happened. So in the Midway operation, when they're prepping for the Japanese offensive, the Marines, they're reinforcing Midway. And if you ever look at the amount of aircraft on Midway, it's insane. I mean, you're talking about B-17s, PBYs, B-26s, SBDs, Vindication, huge. The fuel consumption on Midway is through the roof. And they're obviously worried about the invasion. So the Marines Defense Battalion on the island, in preparation for the potential Japanese invasion, rigged the fuel tanks for demolition should they land. And at the end of May, I think it's about May 22nd, while they're testing the charges, they accidentally detonate them and destroy 400,000 gallons of fuel on Midway Island. Yeah, I don't know who did that, but I can't imagine his fitness report didn't look really good after that. And so the U.S. has to quickly reinforce Midway with fuel. And so they load up actually a commercial freighter, the Nera Luckenbach. They fill it up with just barrels of oil and fuel. And they race it to Midway Island, offload it just before the attack. And what's not commonly known, for example, is that a lot of the aviators on Midway were not flying before June 3rd because there's no fuel. They have to ration the fuel. A lot of the fighters, the dive bombers, did not get training they should have had because there's no fuel for it. They have to wait until the Japanese are sighted. The priority is the PBYs. The other element, and I've noticed this in every order of battle for the Battle of Midway, there was something called the Midway Refueling Unit. So there are 5 fast oilers left. 2 of them are with the fast carriers of Task Force 16 and 17. One, the Sabine, goes up to the Aleutians to support Task Force 8. The Kaskaskia is in Pearl Harbor, coming out of a yard period, and it's waiting to meet the Saratoga coming from the West Coast. But Guadalupe is identified as the Midway Refueling Unit because they realized that Midway was going to run out of fuel. There was a big fear that if the carriers get hit, the air groups would go to Midway, and Midway would fight by itself. And because of the detonation of the fuel storage, because of the bombing attack, if you look at the John Ford video of the attack of Midway, you'll see the above ground fuel tanks are hit. They were targeted specifically by the Japanese. And the Guadalupe was designed to go in fast on evening, go into Midway, pump fuel off, get out before dawn so that it can get out of the area fast, should it be needed. It was not needed. That was not actually done because of the way the Battle of Midway went. But fuel is it's a topic I want to get in more with the Battle of Midway, because if you look at the Japanese, for example, they're bringing 19 oilers with them. And that's a huge diversion of Japanese tankers that should have been doing commercial use. I would argue that one of the reasons you don't see the combined fleet come out as a force for nearly 2 more years till the Philippine Sea is because it doesn't have the oilers. It doesn't have the fuel to do it anymore. Even the Guadalcanal campaign is very much just a portion of the Imperial fleet. And Midway is a battle of resources in many ways.
Just a quick question for you, Sal. You said in the John Ford film, the Japanese attacked the above ground fuel storage areas. Was that, do you think, a direct kind of reaction to the fact that the Japanese felt they had kind of dropped the ball a little bit with Pearl Harbor, and they themselves hadn't targeted enough of the fuel there, or was it just a kind of random thing?
I think they actually learned this from American raids on Japanese islands, because that's what we did. We would continually hit their fuel source. It was a big target we would always hit, and it impacted them quite a bit. When you look at that early Marshall Island raid in February 1st of 1942, when the Enterprise and Yorktown go in, I always make the argument that this is a really significant raid. It doesn't get a lot of attention that I think it deserves, because one of the things they're targeting is number one, submarines, because they want to end the Japanese I-boat offensive against them.
Yeah.
The other thing they're targeting is they're trying to slow up their logistics. They're trying to slow up their advance. And they realize they can't sink a lot of ships because the Japanese do have a pretty vast fleet. It's going to be hard to really sink them. But if you can disrupt their logistics, and if you look at what they do at both Marshall Islands and Gilbert's in 1942 and the Lace Salama raid, they're hitting those logistics. They're really trying to disrupt, slow down the Japanese. I think the Japanese know that. I think the Japanese know that, and they really want to get the fuel away from the island. It's one of the reasons why I don't think they target the airfield, because they want the airfield. They have plans to use the airfield at Midway. They have extra planes on the Kitu Butai that they're going to use. They have a tanker with aviation fuel coming in with the invasion fleet. So I think they really want to cut the legs out. So I do think they're getting smarter about it.
And another question for you, and apologies if it's a Luddite question, and apologies if it's coming up later on. But in the refueling process, with an oiler alongside whatever vessel it is, let's say a carrier, who is in charge of the delivery process? Is it the overall senior rank? Is the fueler commander in charge of it? Is who oversees the operation?
No, one of the things that we start to see happen here is, I'm going to go back up a slide here, is when you look early in the war, one of the things that you see here in the early carrier raids, for example, they're not tying the ships together anymore. They're really evolving here. So initially, the way they would do this is, when you're doing an aircraft carrier, for example, the aircraft carrier would be what we call the guide vessel. And then the tanker would maneuver into position alongside. And one of the things they started doing was using Seaman's eye to estimate the distance. And so they would be able to control it. Another element they did here, I'm going to go back just a slide. Go back a slide here a second. Is this image on the left is a refueling between Neosho and Yorktown in May of 1942. And one of the things they really perfected was to get the distance increased. And the way they did that was by rigging lines from the tanker to the aircraft carrier. And so one of the images you have up here is these blocks and tackle up here, those pulley system up there, that allows you to basically run wires from the aircraft carrier down to the fuel hoses. And that allows you to increase the distance. And so this is the element I think that's missing from a lot of history of this, is that the way we refuel undergoes a series of steps and changes. And so initially the carrier would be the guide, but eventually later in the war, matter of fact, by the time you get to the invasion of Tarawa in November of 1943, the system has changed tremendously. Now the tanker is the guide. It will stay formation. The carriers, which have much more maneuverability than a tanker, the cruisers, the destroyers will come up alongside the aircraft, alongside the oilers. And all the oiler has to do is stay straight, and then the carriers and the more maneuverable vessels will guide themselves. And that actually allows you to start refueling alongside both sides at the same time. And, other small little things. So, for example, the image here always kills me on the lower left here of these guys on the deck of the Neosho just basically being washed away. And one of the things that they do is they eventually fit out a spar deck above it so that they can do everything a deck above, so they're not underwater. And so when, for example, Admiral Morrison does his history of refueling, he is seeing that later version. And when he's critical of Admiral Fletcher, he doesn't know how they did it earlier. So there's a whole evolution. Tom Wildenberg does a great book on tankers and the evolution of underway replenishment and Navy tankers that he talks about it. But again, I don't think he fits this all into the campaigns as much as I'm trying to do.
Okay, thank you.
No, you're good. So let me get to the last part here, and then I'm happy to take questions on everything. That takes you to Guadalcanal and the Guadalcanal operation. So there are two things that stand out in Guadalcanal for me when it comes to logistics. One is the landing, and both of these are the overall commander is again Admiral Fletcher. John Lundenberg's book on Black Shoe Carrier Commander is great. But one of the things is Fletcher, who commanded at Coral Sea, commanded at Midway, he's now at Guadalcanal. And one of the criticisms of Fletcher right from the beginning is he abandons the Marines on Guadalcanal. He pulls his aircraft carriers out after 3 days. And my argument is there's problems with that scenario. Number one, we already knew there was a problem sustaining in the South Pacific. Now, fortunately, things have evolved since April of 1942. There's more tankage now, and there's some tankers, some station tankers stationed down in the area. So there's more logistics. And if you read the assessment in the Gray Book, this is Nimitz's command history that's published and out there in 8 volumes. But if you read the Gray Book, one of the things they note is like, okay, logistics should be good for this operation. We should have enough fuel. We should have enough ships. The issue is going to be coordination, and that's where it falls down. Everybody knows about the problems with the landing rehearsal before Guadalcanal at Coro. Everybody knows that. But the other thing that's not commonly known is that Admiral Gormley, Robert Gormley, who comes from Europe and is now Commander Southern Pacific, Gormley fails, I would argue, absolutely fails to properly coordinate the refueling logistics for Admiral Fletcher. So that before Fletcher goes to Guadalcanal, his task force, Task Force 61, with 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, should be plussed up, should be at full capacity, ready to engage. Same thing with Task Force 62 under Admiral Turner, which are the transports. That doesn't happen. Matter of fact, there's a comical episode here where Fletcher is looking for some commercial tankers that are being sent to one place where he's at another place. And so, he's looking for this big tanker, the S.O. Little Rock, and it's literally every place he just was. And what that means is when Fletcher arrives off Guadalcanal, he's got destroyers that are at 40% fuel. And you have to operate again at 25 knots to do almost constant carry. I mean, he is shuttling aircraft ridiculously on the 3 platforms. And all 3 of his carrier fast task forces are running low on fuel. They're all running low on fuel. And another logistics element I will hit on, Richmond Kelly Turner, is that Turner tells Fletcher, I can unload my transports in 3 days. And he can't. This is a flaw in how they loaded the vessels and their ability to offload. But Fletcher gets the accusation. I just saw it the other day where someone blamed Fletcher for abandoning the Marines. He said, listen, after 3 days, I've got to go fuel. I got to go. And he's got tankers waiting for him, but he doesn't want to bring tankers within air range of the Japanese because the last time he was here, he lost Neosho. And he doesn't want to risk 3 fast tankers and being lost. He can't cycle 1 task force at a time because he wasn't full up. That was his plan. As a matter of fact, that's what he does later on at Eastern Solomons, where he fights Nagumo again in late August of 1942. He is cycling out 1 carrier task force at a time. And again, he gets criticized for that. He's criticized for running out of fuel during the landing, and then he's criticized for being at Eastern Solomons with just 2 of the 3 task forces. He sends Wasp down to go refuel because he doesn't want to refuel within range of the Japanese aircraft. I should also note that he's told that the Japanese fleet is nowhere near him at Eastern Solomons, that the Japanese aircraft carriers are either north of Truk or at Japan. They're not just ready to attack him. And the issue with fuel is an important one. I pose this to anybody out there who can tell me, but I can't recall an instance where a Navy vessel runs out of fuel in World War II where it's not damaged or something like that. The idea of running out of fuel is just anathema to any naval officer. And going into battle in particularly is it. If you look at the logistics they come up with Guadalcanal, just to give you a quick idea, they do another study like they did in April of 42. They identify the fact that they need on a monthly basis, they need 3 fast oilers supporting the fleet. That's 450,000 barrels of fuel. They need 2 fast oilers running to the west coast of the United States and coming back and delivering 1 per month because only the fast oilers can do that. That's another 300,000 tons of 300,000 barrels of oil. And then you need at least 2 commercial tankers arriving every month. That's later altered to every 2 weeks, bringing another 225,000 barrels of fuel. And eventually Nimitz gets to the point where he says, I need two things in September of 42. I need more oilers, and I need commercial tankers coming out capable of doing underway replenishment, at least refueling the big oilers. And that's what you see in September. I would argue September 42 is where this changes, because in September of 42, the first of the T2 tankers come out outfitted as oilers. So he gets a relief, he gets some additional oilers. And now the U-boat offensive has been suppressed on the East Coast. And now he can get more commercial tankers coming out. And now all of a sudden you can begin that transition point where fuel isn't the biggest priority that you had. So a lot to digest there, Paul. I hope I didn't give you too much. I apologize. I can get a little bit enthusiastic when I talk.
No, definitely fantastic. And you're right. I don't remember ever hearing about a ship running out of fuel. And I think it's that you only notice bad special effects in movies. You don't notice the good ones. I think maybe you don't notice because there wasn't the big disaster because of a ship running out of fuel. We overlook it for the entire war. That's kind of the way I'm going with it. If there had been an incident where a ship or a fleet had run out of fuel at a crucial moment, it would be something everybody talks about. But because they were always doing their job and it seemed to always work okay, it just gets overlooked. But we've got some questions for you. So you just kind of mentioned this a little bit, but can you speak on the improvements made in the new built tankers during the war and how many were built later on?
Sure. So, one of the things that happens in World War II is those T3 tankers, those 12 of them and 6 of them are in the Pacific, really become the template for what you want. The U.S., everybody knows about the Liberty Ship program, these freighters that are built in kind of almost a ridiculous number, over 2,700 built. But there's also nearly 500 T2 tankers that are built in a very similar pattern. And so one of the things that the Navy does is start taking over many of those tankers. And what they realize is, okay, we need to set these up. And one of the lessons learned at Guadalcanal, again, not studied a lot, is the fact that they start setting up these underway replenishment groups. When Captain Carter goes down, dispatched by Admiral Nimitz, to look at the logistics issue after the invasion of Guadalcanal, he sets up these service squadron. And the idea is we're going to set up rotating groups of these oilers so that we can continually. So the idea being you would have, maybe 3 oilers out there to replenish the carriers. There will be 3 oilers refueling back up. There are commercial tankers coming in, filling up tanks ashore or waiting tankers, and you can keep it moving. Again, I always argue it's the seamless nature. You tend not to think about it because it works all the time. It's, I live in North Carolina. When a hurricane comes in, the power goes out. I don't go out and rig power lines. There are crews that come that rig my power lines. I don't have to think about it. But that's not the case when you go to the South Pacific and there's no logistics at all. You got to bring this all with you. And this really sets the template up for the Central Pacific Drive when you see the invasions of the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and then you get to Okinawa, where it's a smoothly running operation. And a lot of people look at that and sit there and say, that's a given. And that's where a lot of the histories get their logistics from. It should look like Okinawa, but to get to Okinawa takes a long step process.
A very good, thorough answer there. From Ian Carr, he's asking, did the carrier's aviation spirit get transferred from oilers at the same time as fuel oil when required? Then someone asked a follow-up question, and which had priority?
So the fast oilers were really amazing because they had segregated systems. So you can carry oil for the vessels and black oil for vessels at this time was like tar. It was really nasty stuff. Whereas you're carrying aviation fuel, which is basically gasoline, a really high 100 octane gasoline. So they had multiple piping systems. They had tankage. And one of the best things about the T3 tankers that were used is you could basically use tanks for multiple purposes. Now you had to clean tanks. You couldn't just put ship oil in a tank for aviation fuel. But those tankers were set up so that they can transfer it. And this is one of the reasons why those tankers had multiple hoses that would go over. And what you eventually see is not just one hose go over, but 2 and then 3, and then you double the hoses. So you literally have 6 hoses going over. And one of those rigs may be for just aviation fuel, some for oil, and actually water. It's something we don't ever talk about is pumping of water. Some of the tankers were fitted with water because of the high water consumption. As you get the crews get bigger on these ships because of anti-aircraft guns, the ships can't add water evaporators. And so water becomes a really essential. Matter of fact, you see some tankers converted just for water distillation and water transfer.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Great answer. David K is asking a question. I will kind of add a little bit to it. Were British Empire Commonwealth refueling resources available and or compatible at any time, or were they elsewhere? And of course, when we get to the Solomons, we have Dutch ships as well, Australian users. So is the system basically interchangeable?
So there's an interesting, one of the things I talk about here is the use of several RFA, Royal Fleet Auxiliary vessels, that are set up during early in this period. So for example, when Warspite sails from Puget Sound, because at the beginning of the war or the attack in the Pacific, Warspite's up at Puget Sound getting repaired. It has to sail to India to join the fleet. It has to come through that chain, through that area. So a Royal Fleet Auxiliary tanker is actually dispatched to Bora Bora to meet Warspite to do the transfer, when Aquitania, the passenger liner, after it delivers elements of reinforcements to Singapore, it's heading to the west coast of the United States. It has to be met to be refueled. There's an interesting evolution here where Task Force 44, which is the Anzac Squadron, it's Australia, it's Canberra, it's Hobart, it's a variety of these vessels. They have to learn how to do underway replenishment. And so one of the issues you have is they need some anchorages where they can meet these RFA tankers to do refueling, but then they learn very quickly how to refuel from the American tankers. And so that skill is being developed. So a lot of the proto element, when we see the British Pacific Fleet coming over, that skills are being learned during this campaign. And so, yeah, the RFA plays a big role. As a matter of fact, there's a whole there's a comment in the Gray Book where they're talking about how much oil needs to be delivered to Australia that the U.S. has to pick up. And so there's a conversation with the British about getting Ministry of Transport tankers. How are we going to do that? There's actually convoys on, going from the west coast of Australia. The USS Phoenix is sent out to the west coast of Australia, and you're running armed convoys between the Persian Gulf and Perth and Fremantle periodically, because they're worried about raids coming out of the Dutch East Indies and out of Singapore after April of 1942. Again, not talked about a lot. And then you have the Japanese submarine offensive concurrently with the German U-boat offensive in the Indian Ocean. When you hit, Diego Suarez with the I-boats, when you have the I-boat attack on Sydney, all of those are part of this global logistics issue. And so I would argue this is what you're seeing, how Australia is dealing with the fuel. So this is a big lesson learned here.
Brilliant stuff. Another one from Gary Giamara is asking, do you think it would have been better for the US Navy to have retained the 4 fast tankers as tankers rather than convert them to escort carriers, given other ships were being so converted?
Well, it's an interesting question. I thought about that too. And one of the things you have to do is, I think those 4 carriers, the Sangamon class, are misunderstood for what they're done. So for example, you're converting 25 ships into escort carriers. Initially, they're going to do 25 C3 freighters. These are very commercial freighters. This is the Long Island, this is the Archer, this is the Bitter, this is those early escort carriers. But the Sagamons are really interesting because, number one, they give you a lot more capacity because of the stern propulsion, because the engines are all the way back astern, and you have these huge, massive fuel tanks. It's actually really good for storing aircraft on board. So you can remove the house, you got all this area. And they actually served as oilers too. This is the other thing most people don't know. They actually retained a fueling rig on board because they had vast tanks. So they actually were used both as oilers in that role, plus the 4 of them together were kind of a mini fleet carrier. They were basically converted, much like the Independence class was done, to fill the gap just in case the Essex doesn't come out on time. Again, one of the unsung things is the idea that Essex comes out and there's no problems, and you can put them right into combat. Because when the Sagamons eventually do, when 3 of them arrive in you're going to do a Torch next week, those 4 carriers are there supporting Ranger. And I would argue the reason they're there is because you don't have to pull a fleet carrier. That allows you to pull Wasp to go to the Pacific. But when Wasp is sunk, when Hornet sunk, after Torch, you pull 3 of those 4, and they basically are a cheap fleet carrier. They're not as fast, they're expendable, but they can do what Enterprise or Saratoga can do until you can get Enterprise or Saratoga. You eventually send Enterprise off, you send Saratoga off, those carriers come, Victorious comes, and that gives you your interim for a while. So I think there was a lot of debate about the use of those ships.
Brilliant. Another thorough answer. So Michael Nelson, who's over in Fremantle, I think it's 1 o'clock in the morning there, if I'm correct. He did a show with us about there. He says, does Sal know much more about the supply to the west coast of Australia? I know the US Navy ended up with a load of fuel barges. Would love to know more about the build-up.
Yeah, so one of the big problems that happened here is all of a sudden the west coast of Australia becomes a huge base. I mean, you got submarines operating from there, you have ships operating from there, especially after the Darwin attack. You really need to stage vessels, but there was not enough facilities. When they created Bora Bora Bobcat, they had to establish a fueling base, and I think they were looking at about 250,000 barrels of oil there. And so they learned very quickly how to put up these fuel farms. And one of the things they did is they learned how to set up storage sites. So, while they were setting up the fuel farm, they would bring in one of these older oilers. So, for example, Ramapo, which is one of the oilers that was at Pearl Harbor, goes down the Bora Bora and serves as a station tanker. Barges, I'm glad you mentioned barges, because that's another element they do. So when they're using Perth and Fremantle, they need to set up the shore-based facilities. But in the interim, they use old tankers, they use barges, whatever you could put fuel into, you're doing. One of the things I read was after the Pearl Harbor attack, when ships were coming into Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, they were pumping oil out of them. They were giving them just enough oil to get back to the West Coast, because they needed that oil. They were doing the same thing on the west coast of Australia for a while. If you were sailing back to the Middle East, you were sailing to the Cape, I'm going to take everything you have. We're going to give you bare minimum to get back, because fuel shortage became such a big issue. And eventually it gets relieved. It's one of the reasons why there's a big push to get the British fleet off the east coast of Africa, back to the Maldives, so that you can basically operate clean convoys coming out. But I think that Indian Ocean campaign is never looked at enough for disrupting the flow.
So my final question, really, we've talked about the improvement of the technology. We've talked about the vessels. What about the personnel? I mean, it came up last week in our Gliders Week about this myth that glider pilots in the U.S. Army were the dropouts and the washouts and the not. What sort of people ended up on the Oilers, and were they able to kind of build, an esprit de corps and pride in what they were doing? Because clearly, as you said, you made the case that they always got the job done. Is anything research you've done about what sort of people thrived in that and how the training developed and where their esprit de corps was?
Yeah, unfortunately, like you said, it's the carrier commanders, it is the cruiser commanders, it's those task force commanders that get a lot of attention. But, when you read a book like Beans, Bullets, and Black Oil, written by Admiral Carter, which really talks about the logistics in World War II in the Pacific, one of the things he talks about a lot is how consummate professionals the crews became. It was a big, huge learning element that they had to do. The story of logistics in the Pacific is kind of encapsulated in Mr. Roberts. The idea.
I was just going to mention that. Yeah,
this little freighter going around doing the mundane chores and everything, but it really became absolutely essential. And you read about the proficiency of the amount of ships that they can do. One of the things they perfected was doing night underway replenishments. Coming out of the carrier raid on the Marshalls, the Enterprise, and I think it's Sabine does the first night underway replenishment. This is hard to do in day, let alone when you can't see. And the number of people that die doing this is quite untold. The crews get washed away, they get hurt. It's high risk. You're pumping fuel under a lot of pressure. The hoses blow, wires snap. There's a lot of danger in here. And I think it is an area that needs more. There's a great book, and I wish I could remember the name of it. It's on the history of the Neosho, and it does a great job in encapsulating what that ship does under a captain by the name of Phillips. And Phillips was a great professional mariner. He was a great sailor. He was really good. Unfortunately, to this day, I think logistics is the kind of unwanted stepchild of navies in many ways. Not many admirals fly their flag from a tanker or a cargo ship. It's battleships and cruisers and carriers. And I think we take it for granted in many ways. And it's one of the reasons I really wanted to look at this, is to give those crews the credit for what they did, because you can't get the 6 fast carriers operating for the first 9 months of the war in the Pacific without those 6 fast oilers coming in behind them. And I would argue that they need that attention. And I need to do more work on the crews on it, because I'm really just trying to encapsulate right now the technology and how they play a role in the campaigns. But a great question, and you're exactly right. I mean,
Yeah,
none of
no,
this works without personnel.
exactly, and logistics is always interesting to talk about. And I think, as we said earlier, if it's working well, it doesn't get examined. It only tends to get examined when it's not working well. And if you're too good at your job, you just get overlooked by things. And yeah, the job of those, the Mr. Roberts analogy of days after days of doing apparently very little, but then suddenly a Japanese submarine turns up, or you get attacked by the air, or whatever, and suddenly it becomes a very hostile environment. But it's been a fantastic presentation. What next for you? Obviously, talk about your channel for those who are not familiar with your channel. What do you do there, and what are your hopes for that?
Sure. So, as you very kind of acknowledge, I host a YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping, which looks at commercial shipping largely. I started doing this after the Ever Given. And so, you have great channels like yours for World War II, Drac, which does naval history. I tend to look at really commercial shipping and what's happening with that, putting it into context. So when there's news going on, when there's events happening, I throw in military and naval history as I find it. I like to talk about logistics, but I can never get a logistics channel up and running because if you think we have a hard time getting
Logistics of getting a logistics channel up and running are mind blowing.
it would be very difficult to do. But this article is one I'm submitting to the Naval Institute for their proceedings. And then the book I'm working on right now is a analysis of sea lift during World War I. So going back to that first thing I talked about, that's really where it kind of hit me in that was talking about how you transport the American Expeditionary Force to Europe in World War I. And my goal eventually is to do a true kind of academic history of the U.S. Merchant Marine in World War II. There's been great ones done on the British and many other Merchant Marines, but there really hasn't been one that's been done on the American Merchant Marine in World War II. A lot of little histories that do these kind of there I was first-person accounts, but I would argue there's not a good contextual history of it.
No, I agree. And when I was chatting to Trent earlier in the week, I think we're hopefully at the beginning of an era where maybe the personality-led histories are not behind us, because people will always be writing about Nimitz and Eisenhower and MacArthur, but maybe how did the systems develop, the doctrine. Stan Fisher is coming on my channel later in the year. He wrote a fantastic book about the development of carrier tactics, and I think that's hopefully the area we're going to going into, is examining the methodology, the doctrine, the tactical advances, and just look at how World War II was fought at that kind of almost data-driven era that we can do now. We can look at the charts, we can pull up that stuff from online and say, okay, this is how much they are transporting in this year, this is how much they're doing the next year. When Nigel Askew came on and talked about the Soviet losses in World War II, it was a data-driven approach. So I think that's the kind of era I hope we're beginning to look at now, where we can pull together this information, start looking at the sinews of war, as well as the personalities. Of course, personality is always going to be a big part of it. But Sal, it's been fantastic talking to you. You don't need my good luck with your channel. You've got twice as many people as I have, but it's a fantastic one, and I hope to see you again with another presentation. It's been really, really good. So, and folks, I'm off for the weekend now. Nothing Friday, nothing till Monday, when there's two shows. Michael Nyberg's coming on, and we have Sasha's coming on. That'll be our first of our two Torch to Tunis shows. So just God, how unprofessional. I knew it was coming. I thought I'd better get it done before it came out, but no. So Sal, great talking to you. Thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you all next weekend. Cheers everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Cheers, Paul. Thank you so much.